Hello and welcome to Economics Unscripted, the podcast where sustainability meets business, economics, environment, and everything in between. I'm your host, Ritwij Raj from the Adam Smith Business School's Responsible and Sustainable Management Steering Group, the proud producer of the series. In today's episode, we are exploring the oceanic feelings, democracy, climate governance, and the search for a new global narrative. Together, we'll examine how a deeper emotional and philosophical connection to nature, what our guest calls the oceanic feelings, can inspire more inclusive climate governance and help reshape the stories we tell about the responsibility, community, and our shared planet. Joining me is the Honourable Isabella Lövin, former Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden and a leading advocate for ocean protection and international cooperation. She's also authored a book, The Oceanic Feeling, The Need for a New Narrative, and her work challenges us to imagine democracy and leadership guided by empathy, equity, and long-term vision. Ms. Lövin, thank you so much for being here. It's a real pleasure to have you on the Economics Unscripted.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure.
Ma'am, in your book, you describe the oceanic feeling as a profound sense of connection to nature and humanity. How can this emotional and philosophical concept be translated into concrete climate policies that governments can implement at the global level?
Well, first of all, I have to attribute the concept of oceanic feeling to its author, and that is the Nobel Prize laureate for literature back in the 1920s, Romain Rolland. And I just stumbled across this concept of the oceanic feeling, and I thought it was so beautiful, and then I started to understand what he meant about that. And that is this state when if you look at the starry sky in the night, or if you look out in the ocean, or you have a special contact with nature or an animal for that sake, and you feel your boundaries kind of dissolve, and you forget about yourself, and you feel this deep connectedness to the whole, to the universe, actually. And I felt that this is something that most of us, I would say all of us, recognize these moments that are somehow magical, and where you forget about yourself, and you recognize the immense beauty and the extraordinary magic of the living planet. And that we are now living in an age where we completely disregard and disrespect this magical planet as a living entity where we are a part of it, and just use it as a resource, where we can extract its richness and plunder it. And while we're doing that, most people, I would say, don't feel good about it. You feel that this is wrong. How can we kind of just take down these rainforests and deplete our oceans and treat animals the way we do, and we imagine that we're doing it in a rational way, but actually we do it against ourselves. And I started exploring this, and I wrote this book. I went out much on a book tour and done hundreds of interviews and spoke to thousands of people. And it turns out everyone recognizes this, that what we're doing is wrong. And I think when I was a child, this is also something I tell about in the book. When I was a small child, I was raised in the countryside in Sweden. And our nearest little lake, this was agricultural surroundings with fields and a forest and this lake. But we were not allowed to swim in that lake when I was a child, because there was a nearby industry, a pulp industry, that was allowed to just flush out all its toxics and remains directly into a small stream that led out into this lake. And when I was a child, I couldn't really understand, how is this possible? How can adults allow this to happen? And this is kind of a question has followed me throughout my life, that why are we doing things when we can obviously see that this is not good? And there's also alternatives. There's also other solutions. Back in my old childhood neighborhood and area, now this industry does not emit these sulfurs and dangerous substances anymore, because there's legislation, and now with legislation you will have solutions. Almost all industries that I meet are telling me you just have to give us the right instructions and legislation, and then we can sort it out. And that is maybe the answer to your question. So how can the oceanic feeling guide us in climate policy and legislation? I think once we recognize that we actually have a deep connection to nature, that it makes us feel good, that it makes us feel bad to destroy our own planet, especially for our children and grandchildren and for the whole future. Today, we just heard we're already at 1.49 degrees above Celsius. Copernicus satellite system was telling us that. I mean, we don't feel good about that. But if we recognize this emotional feeling, not only the numbers and the economics of it when we're talking about next year's earning or employment for this and this company for 1 year ahead, we have to think long term, and we have to take responsibility. And once we get legislation in place, my experience from Sweden is that the industries, the companies, they find the solutions. They have done that in Sweden. We have almost no fossil fuel energy production. We have come a long way when it comes to reducing CO2 emissions, and that is because of long-term legislation. And basically also, I think Sweden is still a country where we have a deep connection with nature.
Yeah. So now coming to, in your book, you argue that humanity's failure to act on global crises stems from dominant narratives of egoism and individualism. So how do you envision reshaping national and international narratives to promote collective responsibility without alienating existing political and economic institutions?
So I think it's not an easy question to answer, but I think it's up to all of us. I think it's about political leadership, but I also think it's about intellectuals, scientists, churches, religious leaders, and everyone to take part of this conversation. And basically, we have to recognize, looking back in history, that the kind of reality that we think today is only natural, with, let's say, rampant capitalism, well, now showing its face in the US with Trump and his billionaire friends wanted to take over Greenland, and drill baby drill kind of mentality, and totally disregarding science. We must somehow just recognize that this mentality has come to a dead end, and we need something new. And we need to get together again and recognize the force of collaboration rather than competition. And I don't think we will ever solve the climate crisis, nor the crisis of biodiversity or the blatant abuses of human rights, if we don't get back to the sense that the humanity basically is a species that has come so far, not because we are, like Darwin says, the competition of the strongest, but rather that we are really adapted to collaboration, that we take care of the weakest, we help our children, we help our elderly, we listen to those that have the best solutions. Everyone, this kind of notion that humanity, the modern society, is a result of everyone's war against everyone, it's totally flawed. It's totally false. And I think one thing that I mentioned in the book also is about The Lord of the Flies, William Golding's famous novel that was written sometime after the Second World War. And it has been read by almost all young people in generations in the US, in the Western world. And it's about this boat with boys around 10 to 12 years old who are shipwrecked on a Pacific island, small island. And it kind of immediately it tells the story of how they start fighting each other once they don't have any adults there to rule them or to keep them under control. Then they go back to their basic instincts. That's the whole idea. Also, very much the idea of Sigmund Freud, that deep down we're just kind of beasts, and our natural instinct is just to go ahead and try to fight each other, and the strongest must win. But this story, the William Golding story, this should have been a true story. But it turns out the true story was there was such a shipwreck with the young boys, but they survived for several months and even more than a year by collaborating, not fighting each other, by helping each other, by sitting around. They kept a fire alive for all these months, sat around the fire in the nights, and they also constructed some musical instruments, and they sang together, they helped each other. That's humanity. That's humanity's basic instincts, not to immediately run away and try to kill each other. But that's the mentality that is kind of governing very much of our present politics, geopolitics, very much now with Trump in the White House. And that's gonna have a disastrous end if we don't kind of take our leadership now and not go down that road, but continue with trying to cooperate, help each other, have humanity's best collectively as our goal, not to have individual mass richness for each and every one, and letting everyone else that you don't care about anyone else. So that's the recipe for disaster, I would say. We need a new recipe, and we need a new narrative, which is one part of the title of the book.
Yeah. Now coming to the women in leadership, the widely circulated image of Hughes signing Sweden's climate law in 2017, surrounded by women, highlights the intersection of gender and leadership, even in the field of climate as well. So how important is gender equity in global climate governance, and what lessons can other countries draw from Sweden's experience and Sweden's stride in women's rights across fields?
Well, I hope a lot. I mean, Sweden has had a long history of women's rights and the fight for women's rights. And it has taken different expressions over the last century. And finally, when I was in government, we actually proclaimed ourselves as being a feminist government. That was taken a little bit, people were a bit wondering, what does that mean to be a feminist government? But it meant always to have the perspective of gender equality in all the political decisions that we make. And if you look at climate policy, I think women might have a willingness to think more long term about the consequences of climate change for their children and generations to come than many, I won't say all, but many male leaders who just think about conquering and economic growth. So I think that had that was part of our concept. When I signed the climate law in 2017, it was the time when Donald Trump first came into the White House, and he signed the first executive order that he signed was the so-called global gag rule. And the global gag rule is when the US withdraw all their economic support to organizations that support sexual and reproductive health and rights things for women and men also, of course, in developing countries. To talk about contraceptives or legal abortions, safe abortions. So I decided to sign, and he signed that presidential order surrounded by only men. It was really kind of cynical to see that picture. So I decided to do something similar when I signed the Swedish climate law, and I was surrounded only by women. And then I posted it on Twitter. It was Twitter back then, and and that picture actually went very, very viral. And there were so many people around the world who kind of were longing for some kind of different leadership, showing that there's different values that actually can guide a real government. At that time, our government, a feminist government. So that meant a lot to many people. Today, I feel a little bit more pessimistic and sad about developments here in Europe, but not least in the US, because we have a very far-right political advancement in the European Union, and not to talk about the US. So now it's like you can't say feminist, you can't even say climate or green, because that's something that is considered to be too extreme. These movements are trying to paint the picture like that. But I think also we need to be very clear on the fact that the pushback on climate policies and climate action, where does it come from? We're challenging multi-billion-dollar income and companies around the world. Many countries that are totally dependent on oil or gas for their entire income, like Russia, like Saudi Arabia, like many countries in the Middle East. And they're seeing that the European Union and the world is going in the direction of the Paris Agreement. And of course, they're fighting back. They're fighting back. And that is also something I discovered when I wrote this book, Oceanic Feeling, how long this, let's say, counter lobbying has been going on ever since the Kyoto Protocol was going to be signed by the US. Before that, there was no discussion about climate science, but it's been financed by some think tanks that were financed by the oil lobby in the US and then in other countries to try to prevent the US from signing the Kyoto Protocol, and they succeeded. And then little by little, the climate change facts that were on the table were portrayed as being one part of the story. They financed some so-called scientists that came up with different theories about why this was not so dangerous or even a hoax and so on. And now we have it's the whole Congress in the US is more or less not the Democrats, but the Republican Party has become a climate denier party. And you also see a lot of that here in the European Union, and that's scary. So there's a lot of a lot of progress that now is being ripped away in the European Union, also legislation, and that's really scary. And also on how we can use the words, because I was talking about feminist, and now you can't even talk about that because you will be labeled as an extremist or whatever, left, whatever they're talking about, and it's really scary how these human rights values, the Human Rights Charter of the UN, all these things that have been accepted for a century now almost, are now being challenged.
Now, returning to our topic of climate governance. So, climate change and ocean governance require unprecedented level of global governance and global cooperation. So, how can countries balance national interests with the collective need for sanitary stewardship? And which mechanisms do you believe are most effective for building trust and collaboration? Because we live in a world which is very diverse. We live in a world where countries have different political systems, different economic statuses. So how do we manage global governance in climate change in the area of climate change?
Right. So this is the big question mark right now. So we're seeing that we were very off track when it comes to reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement. We managed actually 2 years ago, which was a huge success considering the geopolitical context, to have an agreement on management on the international waters, so areas beyond national jurisdiction at the UN. So that was a big step forward. We haven't had that. So far, 50% of the entire planet, which is the blue side of this globe, has been without any binding regulations at all, except for some of the straddling fish stocks. So this is one example where we actually have made progress. But how can we make it more efficient? I would say with the existing tools that we have, it's frustrating, because it's basically how the international system is set up is based on that you voluntarily abide by these agreements when it comes to the transnational things like oceans and even climate. So like the US now is just leaving the Paris Agreement and the UN Convention on Climate Change. And they can do that without any repercussion. I mean, there's no sanctions if you don't collaborate. And how can we introduce those sanctions? I mean, it is about, again, we have to see ourselves as a global community. We have to identify ourselves as citizens of this planet, not by different countries. And once we do that, once we recognize that the oceans, for instance, the ocean is just one. It doesn't know any boundaries in this blue infinite space. The fish, they don't know if they're in Sweden or in Norway. They don't know if they're in Mexico or in the US. So we have to collaborate, and we have to be if we want to do something efficiently, then we have to make sure we look at the ecosystem as a whole and support each other's. And we haven't been doing this enough. And today, sadly, today as we speak, we don't know what's going to happen with the US and Greenland. Things are changing enormously fast. And I just have one wish, and that is that we don't forget about these global commons that we have, which is the ocean, which is the climate, which is biodiversity, transboundary biodiversity, and also our common humanity because of this new introduction of military threats and challenging of the world order. So we must we must really be very aware of these threats and try to understand that we are all global citizens. But this is, we're talking in a time where we're talking about more and more dominance rather than collaboration globally, and that is really worrying.
Yep. So your work is deeply hopeful, emphasizing that climate change, that change is possible with sufficient will and vision. So what practical steps can citizens, young leaders, and policymakers take today to cultivate this hope and translate it into meaningful actions? If you have any insights for young generation, young leaders, and young policymakers that how can they take the challenge of climate change head on?
Right. So I think at this moment, I mean, it's different from what realities you live in, what country you live in, what part of the world you live in. My sense right now, coming from Europe and from Sweden, is that there's very many strong voices right now with many progressive and responsible companies who see that there's an economy in going for zero emissions with new technology, with the circular economy, and they have already invested in that. There's so many also young researchers and innovators that have very good solutions. And you said that I'm very optimistic in my book. Yes, this was written before Trump too, but I see that we have the technical possibilities to go to a zero emissions world. There's no problem. I mean, we could have had, gone away from combustion engines like 100 years ago if there just had been the political will to do it. But I think politicians listen somewhat more, maybe, to companies and economic interests than they do only to civil society. So this is maybe something to try and start some kind of collaboration with those actors that you see that are really acting sustainably and in an innovative way, but also getting together in your workplace or in your university or school or neighborhood and join your voices. I think that's also very, very effective. And I wish, it was wonderful during those years when we had Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future movement. Then the pandemic came and put an end to that. But the voices of all the young and the children there was really powerful. And it changed a lot of politicians' minds. But we need maybe also again to see such a movement. But also put your trust in democracy. Just don't only go to the streets. But, some of you might want to get into politics. Some of you might want to kind of really dig your hands into doing this, because someone has to do it on the other side as well. It's not only about, leaving the arena to professional politicians that have been there for forever. There's many examples of new parties that can be started, or you can join an old one, and you can really make your voice heard. And this is also my personal experience, because I entered politics when I was 46. And before that, I was a writer and a journalist. And I actually have been able to be in here and kind of doing the political handicraft, I call it in Swedish. I don't know if it translates well into English, but anyway, so you have to be there, you have to put the proposals, you have to do the debate, you have to really be in there long term. And actually you can make a change. And I know that from my own experience.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing your insights and generous reflections with us today. Your insights reminded us that addressing the climate crisis is not only a technical or economic challenge, but a deeply human one. And what stands out most is the idea that meaningful climate action begins with how we see ourselves in relation to one another and to the planet we share. Thank you for helping us imagining a future grounded not in fear or fragmentation, but in solidarity and hope. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on Economic Unscripted. Please do feel free to check out the book written by our guest. The link to the book is attached in the description box below. And if this conversation resonated with you, we encourage you to keep questioning, keep engaging, and keep rethinking the stories that shape our world. Until next time, I'm Ritwij Raj, and this has been Economic Unscripted. Thank you so much.